Good afternoon, and welcome to the Swiftcurrent Museum and today's Lunch and Learn. I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered here today on Treaty 4 territory, the ancestral land of the Cree, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota nations, and the home of the Métis people. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors, the City of Swift Current, SAS Culture, SAS Glottos, as well as the Southwest Naturalists who help organize Dr. Gjetvaj Branimir. Let's just go with Dr. Branimir.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, to come and speak with us today. The Naturalists will also be hosting their meeting, their monthly meeting directly after today's Lunch and Learn, and we encourage all of you to stay and participate. Just before I welcome our guest speaker, a few housekeeping items. Our washrooms are located just through the gift shop in the back hallway. Our temporary exhibit, Beyond Human Limits, will close next weekend, and then shortly after that, we'll be installing an exhibit called The Ones We Met, covering the Franklin expedition. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Branimir for the Prairie Food Systems Visionary Network. He is a Saskatoon-based biologist, environmental photographer, and a dedicated natural conservationist. He is interested in issues that connect land use, biodiversity conservation, and food securities. Branimir has served on the board of directors on several environmental not-for-profit organizations, as well as an appointed member of the University of Saskatchewan Senate. He has published 2 award-winning books on prairie conservation, The Great Sandhills, A Prairie Oasis, and The Island of Grass. In 2013, Branimir was recognized as the Canadian Environmental Law Association for extensive participation in environmental not-for-profit organizations and for his use of photography to advance environmental conservation. Please join me in welcoming him today.
Hello, everybody. Is this mic working?
It is. I'm going to turn it up just a hair.
Okay. Are you lonesome tonight? La, 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 la. Is this better now? Okay, yeah. We just have to watch the microphone for the... Hello? Oh, yeah, that's better. Way better. Okay. So maybe a little bit down. Is there echo? Yeah. Yeah, a little bit down for the echo, and I'm continue talking, blabbing. Okay, excellent, thank you. Sir, if you can keep on standing, then we can say that it's a standing room only. That would really be absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, and I'm really happy to see such a big crowd. Thanks for coming today. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit, trying to combine my interest in agriculture, sustainable agriculture, and nature conservation. And Carla told me that this crowd will be more conservationist.
Can you turn it up just a little, please?
Just a little bit up. Talk a little. We put it down because there's a bit of an echo. So is your microphone working over there? Mm-hmm. Hopefully working.
For
okay.
the video.
So I would deal with the technical fine-tuning. So what I'm going to talk about is perspective from a biologist. So how is that? Is that good? Okay, excellent, not too much echo. I will talk more about biodiversity conservation, then I will talk about sustainable agriculture, because I hope that is a crowd today. That's what I've been told. We'll see. If I really miss my presentation, I'll just blame somebody else. So the problem that we're encountering is when we think about the biodiversity conservation 10, 20, 30 years ago, it was relatively simple. But now what is happening with all of these stressors on the environment combining with human expansion of the population, climate change, degradation of the environment, the old ideas of protecting nature through conservation areas and protected area networks combined with our pressure on the environment to produce food, they are increasingly being viewed as inadequate to prevent the environmental degradation and biodiversity loss. So what I'm going to try to talk to you today, that we really need to look as a system, thinking about nature conservation and having sustainable food production as a one problem, and solutions that will deal with both will benefit both biodiversity and agriculture, food security. So So you think about the global risk that you're facing today. We hear a lot about the climate emergency and especially huge swings in weather conditions, and that's going to get worse and worse. We also see we are facing the loss of biological diversity, and then thinking about the COVID pandemic and other zoonotic diseases that we are probably going to be facing more often than we expect. So what do you guys think? What is these three risks, what do they have in common? Can anybody think about it? So all of these things in common, they have a land use, right? So how do we approach the land management and land use planning? This is essential to addressing sustainability issues, right? Including biodiversity conservation, and also we have to think about there are nature-based solutions to the climate change, and also there are nature-based solutions to food security. So these are the issues that we have to think in unison. And sometimes we do not treat the land very well, right? So we need to stop degrading natural landscape. For example, here, burning of the forest to convert it into the cropland. So what you think here, this is not a picture from the Amazon rainforest. This is from the Aspen Parkland, just northwest of Regina. That's a large swath of the Aspen Parkland was being burned, and then eventually it will be bulldozed. Whatever remnants of material is left, it will be bulldozed, pushed on the side, and this land will be converted into crop production. And then we see more of that land use changes happening. I've been coming to Swift Current and Grasslands National Park for the last 13 years, and I was just watching the area north of Kyle that used to have a lot of shelter belts. However, right now, there's almost not a single tree that you can see wherever you look around. So that is the changes that we see gradually, and there is what they call the shifting balance, shifting baseline, that when we look today and think it's normal, but when you look at the pictures or you try to remember what happened 20, 30 years ago, there's a huge changes in the environment. So in 2019, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, I'll refer to IPBS, they released assessment report on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So this landmark report, it warned us that the nature and biosphere integrity are declining globally and raised unprecedented in human history. And those changes have a negative impact on the people around the world. This report also stressed that we need for the fundamental change, how do we interact with the natural environment? Example, what I see here with the biodiversity decline, biodiversity loss, when we look around here, a lot of people probably in this crowd are interested in the birds. And there is a quite dramatic decline in the species in North America. And if you look at the graph on the right, the grasslands birds are the ones who experience the largest rate of decline. So I'm just giving you a little bit of a primer on protected areas that we'll talk about. Conservation is the area-based conservation approaches such as protected areas. They are cornerstone biodiversity conservation, right? Over the last 10 years, protected areas expanded from covering 14 to about 17% of the global land and freshwater environment. And then expanded from about 3% to 7.5% of marine areas. In addition to the strictly protected areas, there are some other areas that we use for conservation, and they are a combination of conservation and the working land where people do use them for producing food, producing fiber. And those areas are collectively called Other Effective Area-Based Conservation Measures, or OECMs, that you see here quite often abbreviations on those areas can be run either privately through non-government organizations and groups. One example is Nature Conservancy, and I think a lot of people will go after this meeting. There's an opening event, and NCC is organizing just north of the town. A lot of community groups, and increasingly they're led by the indigenous peoples through IPCA, so Indigenous Protected and Conservation Areas. And we see more and more of these lands are run by the First Nations. OECMs have often been overlooked in most national biodiversity policies and strategies over the past decade. Interest in OECMs and Indigenous Protected Conservation Areas are really rising, and we will see more and more of that. So, on the biodiversity side of the ledger, the large protected areas are managed for the long-term conservation of nature. And there's one example in Grasslands National Park, just about an hour south of here. That is one example of strictly protected areas. They provide suitable space for species that are susceptible to disturbance or habitat fragmentation. For example, greater sage-grouse, that we do have a few lacks, really dramatically reduce the number and populations in Saskatchewan and Alberta. So we do have protected areas to a design to protect species and conservation. However, species populations within and outside protected areas continue to decline. And that is primarily because those protected areas are becoming more and more isolated. And over the long term, we will continue to lose species because there's no buffering around them. There we see more and more encroachment of human settlements, and here in the prairie provinces, encroachment of cropland, an area that is used for food production. And those protected areas are becoming more and more isolated and separate from each other, right? So those areas surrounding protected areas are very important for the whole life cycle of species because, for example, migratory species, they use those areas between protected areas for staging or other parts of their life cycle. So if they have suitable habitat, they'll be okay. However, if we don't have suitable habitat, then those species will be problematic. So this is why it's important to think about areas surrounding protected areas, right? So focusing on large protected area conservation strategy alone will not be sufficient without including conservation efforts to protect surrounding small, often isolated habitat patches, right? So this is particularly important in heavily modified, human-dominated landscape such as agricultural land. So for biodiversity conservation, the effectiveness of protected areas is significantly influenced by the type of land cover and management of surrounding lands. And I did see, we can maybe talk with the NCC people, there are some projects in coordination with Parks Canada to try to coordinate working with combining and maybe joining the forces to have protected areas for national parks and other strictly protected areas, and working lands that are managed by nonprofit organizations and land trusts. So those buffer areas that will surround strictly protected areas, for example, Grasslands National Park, could help and assist our conservation efforts, right? So what do we need? We need a complex matrix of wildlife-friendly landscapes that are established for working land conservation. For example, pasture land, which is used for producing food, for raising cattle, but also grasslands, properly managed grasslands are very important as a habitat for many species. So those areas of working landscapes will complement protected areas by providing necessary habitat for some species, while assisting dispersal and adaptation to climate change for the others. So there is a growing understanding of the links between diversity and ecosystem function. So more diversity we have more stable and better functioning ecosystems. and also resilience to disturbance such as climate change, right? So if we are improving biological and especially functional diversity, how the system function and operate, both on the farm, protected areas, and globally on the landscape, that will greatly assist us in protected nature, but also it will assist us in having stable and resilient food systems. And especially this is going to be very important when we see impacts of the climate change going forward. So conservation of species diversity in agricultural landscapes is critical, not only to stop the overall decline of biodiversity, but also to ensure the maintenance of multiple biological functions, some of them delivering important services for agroecosystems. For example, pollination, pest control, water regime systems, and capturing of organic material in our croplands. So we talk about the biodiversity, we'll talk a little bit about the climate change. In the same year, 2019, United Nations Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change released their own special report on climate change and land with a warning that we have to fundamentally change how we manage the land, how we produce and consume food, and how we sustainably reduce food waste in order to minimize the effects of climate change and environmental degradation. Increases in greenhouse gas emissions have been linked to rising temperatures. With the graph that you see here, the study that was done by the Environment Climate Change Canada, since 1948 that they conducted this study, Canada's annual average temperature of the land has warmed by 1.7 degrees Celsius. And Canada, on average, is experiencing warming twice the rate of the rest of the world. At Canadian Arctic, that is one source of the rising temperature, is warming at an even faster rate, right? So we see here on the right, there's a map, which part of Canada is increasing the average temperature. So we have a bit on the prairies over here, central Saskatchewan, but then Northwest Territories, and further north in the Arctic, where we'll see the most drastic change. So, Environment Climate Change Canada report is warming. Also, the weather will intensify, and we'll see more and more severity of heat waves, and that will increase the higher risk of drought and wildfires. And we saw wildfires last year. It was quite drastic, and huge parts of the land, especially British Columbia, northern Alberta, went up in the smoke. So the image that you see here was this drought in August of 21 near Saskatoon. So in addition to the swings in extreme heat episodes, we will see more intense and more drastic rainfall, and that will increase the flood risks, because all of that water that is coming down in a short period of time will have difficulty kind of dissipating into the land, or maybe just running off into the waterways. What you see here is the flooding in the Maple Creek after intense rains in June of 2010, so almost 14 years ago. This is interesting what I found in March of 22. I took a screenshot from my phone, and then in the overnight, the temperature, so mid-March, it was minus 32 degrees Celsius. And then during the day, 12 hours later, it was plus 3 degrees Celsius. So in 12 hours, there's a change in 35 degrees Celsius. And we'll see more and more of that, because the air circulation and weather patterns really is starting to get messed up. And that's what some people started to call it as a global weirding. We have the weird weather patterns that are coming. How are we doing with time? Pretty good there. So just one chart connection between nature and the climate change. In the last several years, there's a whole bunch of papers and talk about nature-based solutions, which would provide immediate opportunity to harness and use the power of nature to mitigate the climate change. So I'm just going to give you the definition that nature-based solutions are actions to protect, manage, and restore forests, grasslands, wetlands, and agricultural lands that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions and sequester carbon from the atmosphere. There was a study done in 2021 that showed that nature-based solutions have potential to cut Canada's greenhouse gas emissions up to 11% of current level by 2030. So these nature-based solutions, if implemented, will help us dealing with the climate change and mitigate climate change, but also they will help with the biodiversity conservation, right? Because here's an example with the grasslands. They have maintaining healthy and functioning grasslands will help capturing carbon, but also will help those birds that we see that are declining at a really drastic rate. So just I won't bother you too, but think about it too, that nature is, maintaining healthy nature is important for biodiversity protection, but it's also important to mitigate the effect of climate change. So how much deterioration of the Earth system is there, right? Scientists from the Stockholm-based Resilience Institute, they introduced the concept of planetary boundaries over 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, and also to talk about a safe operating space for humanity. So what are the planetary boundaries? They're intended to present Earth system processes which, if pushed over a certain limit, could generate unacceptable system change. What you see here from the illustration, we have overstepped 4 out of 8 safe planetary boundaries, which would be climate change, biosphere integrity, that's biodiversity. We have land system change, how we change the surface of the land to suit our needs. And then we bypass the biogeochemical flows and especially release and phosphorus and nitrogen into the environment. So what do these biogeochemical flows, land system change, biosphere integrity, and climate change have in common? What do you think? It's agriculture, the way how we produce food, because agriculture is the largest, it has the largest impact on the environment. So I found a quite a cute definition that the agriculture is the largest interface between humanity and the natural world. So the way how we produce food for our own needs really has a huge impact on the natural systems through land use change, biodiversity decline, and also release of phosphorus and nitrogen in the system. So agriculture and the global food systems are the primary drivers of biodiversity loss due to habitat loss and also greenhouse gas emissions that impact climate, especially greenhouse emissions through nitrogen and methane emissions. At the same time, food production is negatively impacted by these anthropogenic pressures. So I saw a few times that the people talk about the agri-suicide. The way we produce food really impacts the environment, and those changes in the environment impacts our ability to produce food in a safe and sustainable manner. So we really need to think how we produce food, what is the way that we produce, because we do need to eat food, but we have to rethink how do we get it. So for the next few slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about the fate of nature in agricultural landscapes. So agricultural activities are considered to be the single largest driver of environmental change that I mentioned before. For example, in North America, over 80% of native grasslands have been converted to crop production or other uses. Through the impacts on available habitat, agriculture is also the leading cause of biodiversity loss. So what do we see in our agricultural landscape? You just have to go a few minutes outside of the Swift Current and you can see dramatic changes of the landscape, right? So a lot of natural features such as shelterbirds and wetlands have been removed from agricultural landscape in increasing rate, very dramatically. However, a lot of those changes really do not produce higher impact in yields. So a lot of the lands are being converted, whether they are marginal lands or areas around wetlands, that do not produce increases in yield. So I found this study that was looking in the United States between 2008 to 2016, so 8 years, croplands have expanded at the rate of over 1 million acres a year, whereas the 70% of the new cropland areas produce yields below the national average. And the average yield deficit was 6.5%. So we have 6.5% reduction in the average yield by expanding crop production in the area that are not suitable for growing food. So we have to think about it. Where do we continue? Can we continue at that rate? And what are the impacts and what are the costs? So the current model of high input intensive production of agricultural commodities, they're rank high in provisioning services, so meaning we have a high crop yield, but they provide only low levels of regulating, supporting, and cultural services. So regulating, supporting, thinking about water control, hydrological cycles, pollination, pest control, and other services of other contributions from nature to people. With the agriculture intensification, it is leading to simplification of landscape structure. We see more monocrops and large areas that are really having only one use, with concurrent loss of biodiversity and also potential reduction in system resilience. So think about if you have your retirement savings in Nortel stock, right? So for a while, that Nortel stock was returning a really good yield. So it's like, oh, I'm making more money, I'll buy more Nortel stocks, right? So at the end, you have 70, 80, 90% of your retirement in Nortel stocks, making a lot of money for a short period of time, but then we know what happened with the Nortel stocks, right? Similar thing is happening on the landscapes. We're really relying on pushing for more yield and more productivity, but that is going to bite us in the rear end at the end, I think. And we already have example that in 30s, where had a huge expansion of cropland, and we change in the climate, produce dramatic impacts called dirty 30s, right? We see this degradation of cropland and quality of the land, a reduced ability to produce food. So increased production have impact on reducing the food prices, and we get more and more food. However, with the trade, we also increase how much food we have available. However, the affordability of the food items has improved over time, but food systems of all types are falling short of delivering optimal nutrition and health outcomes, right? So people are getting, obesity is on the rise. We see more and more hungry people, about 800 million. However, between 1.2 and 1.4 billion people on the planet are obese and overweight, and that gap is actually increasing. So we're having more and more food. The food is getting cheaper, but that is not bringing the health outcomes that we want. And there's also another negative effect, is that the food waste. We are throwing away a lot of food. So is the cheap food really desirable? There's some studies that show that globally, between 30 and 40% of the food is being wasted. And I found one study in Guelph that they found that in Canada, between 50 and 60% of the food is being thrown away. So if we are really trying to change natural habits, farmers who are more interested, producers who are more interested in regenerative practices and agroecology. I change this presentation. I do not put a lot of, I take some of biodiversity aspect out, and I put more talk about practices that they can use and how those practices will benefit their operations. So I do change my talk. Yeah, that's why I asked, was the expected crowd? So that's why I put a lot of birds and the bees in my presentation today. I tell a little bit different story when I talk to producers, where basically it's a matter of economics, right? We have to deal a lot with perceptions. A lot of people, a lot of producers who really want to do a good thing, positive things, there's a lot of peer pressure, and they're not being accepted in the community. So we do need to provide support to producers who go against the grain. They're ostracized in the community when they go on a coffee row. That you are nuts, why are you keeping the trees? But then what happened when they tell me the stories, in the drought years, regenerate producers, his or her fields are green, and conventional producers, the fields are dry. And then really conversations start. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Very informative and lots to consider and think about moving forward. So thank you again. Before anyone ducks out, if you're interested, we do have 2 of his different books for sale in our gift store. So feel free to stop by and have a look at those. And
I
also,
can even sign them.
he can sign them. That's perfect.